Hello, everyone. My name is Aldo, and I am today's host for today's webinar, which focuses on empowering voices, building an inclusive workspace for the deaf community. I want to remind everyone and actually encourage individuals to take closed captioning into consideration while watching this video. So, what are we going to be discussing in today's webinar? That is a great question, and I love to answer it. Let's take a look. Today, we are going to be talking about the dimensions of inequality, and typically there are four, but we are discussing on systemic, institutional, and interpersonal. From there, we are branching on into deaf culture and learning a quick history crash course on it. From there, we are understanding ASL, the structure of it, how it's different from English, and also do a crash course taught by me on basic science that you can use for your next conversation with anyone. From there, we're going to get into an in depth understanding of the American Disability Act and how it pertains to what we're discussing about, and that's on building steps to inclusivity, which is our very last takeaway from this webinar. I hope in today's pre-work that you were able to take in participation, you were able to understand where you fell in the spectrum of your view between individuals who have disabilities and how you might come out differently throughout this webinar in your experience of learning. Uh, so let's dive in. So, I have this quote here that I want you to take into consideration throughout the video. So, as long as we have deaf people on Earth, we will have signs. And by saying this, we are able to understand that the deaf community are members of our society. They are not to fall off from our societal. No, we need to be more inclusive. We need to recognize them and also recognize that the language themselves that they have, American Sign Language, is a beautiful language and is their form of communication and should be encouraged, which I'll dive into a little bit as to why I mean encourage. So, dimensions of inequality. In today's webinar, we are focusing on systemic, institutional, and interpersonal, as I mentioned before. So, with systemic, it is my understanding and your understanding that it is morely focused on a cultural background. And I provided definitions here for you to better understand what these dimensions of inequalities pertain to. But I will provide quick examples as to how we could see them in a deaf community aspect. So, with systemic, if an individual who is hearing had no background or limited background to anything pertaining to deaf community, so that's either their education, their language, their history, their background, things like that, they may be more ignorant to recognize an individuals to be part of society. And so, in this aspect, it could be that this hearing person would be creating a negative impact and would be perceived as creating and believing negative stereotypes and encouraging them thinking that these are true based off it. Now, institutional, it is my understanding that these are pertaining to policies and regulations. And so, what we could see in this example would be in the aspect that if there were policies and regulations that disencouraged members of the deaf community, deaf employees, to perceive and pursue higher opportunities for their careers, they may be not encouraged to participate in higher projects, networking, or even participating in team dynamics. Now, interpersonal, this is more on a conversational level, in my point of view. It's more of communication between an individual and another. And by doing so, an individual may be coming into with a background that, well, let's take into consideration a hearing person and a deaf person. This hearing person has limited background understanding of the deaf community and kind of like the systemic, and so they may say a comment that is abruptly a stereotype, and so the individual who is deaf is taking impact to that comment made by their colleagues and suggest that, like, hey, this is not true and blah blah blah. But then this person's like, the hearing person's like, you don't know what you're talking about, blah blah blah. And these are in the aspects uh, inequality, racist discrimination that one may not be aware of. So it is important to take into consideration these three dimensions of inequality throughout the video. So why focus on the deaf? Well, typically they make up 3.6 of the adult population in the United States. So roughly that's about 11 million people. And these are individuals who are deaf or identify as deaf as of 2021. But 48 million people who have hearing loss, yes, hearing loss, due to aging or other factors, these 48 million are outside of the 11 million. So now let's take into the consideration at the aspect of 35% of members of the deaf community are employed in the United States in comparison to the general population itself is 63%. And this is of course outside this excluding the deaf community. And so there's a huge gap between employment opportunities or individuals who are employed currently in the United States. Also, we are going to focus on two deaf people about the deaf people and the way that they receive their income, and to the aspect of deaf people make about 40 to 45% less in income compared to their hearing counterparts, and this is reflected through their checks, opportunity for growth in their employment, or any aspect. So they are making significantly much less, even though they share the same title, role, background, experience, or education as their hearing counterpart. And so, in correlation to reason number two, one third of deaf students reported receiving poor post-secondary advice and are limited from employment. So typically this is an educational institutional level where their advisors are encouraging students to participate into attending college, higher education, or even seeking employment, and are limited into positions that pertain to them rather than finding opportunities that they will be able to grow from. So let's look into deaf culture. So when talking about deaf culture, we need to talk about two significant founding fathers that made up the deaf community, and quite frankly, as well as their language, which is what makes the culture itself rich. So, Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet was an American hard of hearing individual, compared to Laurent Clerc, who was a deaf Frenchman. So, quick little story. Laurent Clerc taught Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet when he visited France and taught him French Sign Language. Gallaudet recognized that education for the deaf community was huge and lacking, and so by doing so, they also recognized that there was a limited communication format for individuals who were deaf. Remember, I told you as early on in the presentation that the deaf community weren't considered as individuals of society at the time. So what Gallaudet did was they pursued and created a university, which kind of falls into the education aspect of the deaf culture, which is Gallaudet University. And Gallaudet University was one of the first institutions that focused on providing higher education for individuals who were deaf. And by doing so, they were able to teach them in their own rich culture and have professors and deans that felt and reflected the community. And by doing so, they were able to create an inclusive environment by doing that. But here's the kicker. ASL was prohibited for 100 plus years until 1970. So this is in correlation to the education aspect that even though they were teaching them in their sign language, uh, uh, this was actually prohibited. And so ASL was prohibited for 100 plus years. And the reason why was because Alexander Graham Bell, yes, Alexander Graham Bell, he suggested, and here's the ironic part, he had a wife who was deaf, a mother who was deaf. And he suggested that the community should include and only learn to what is known as today as oralism. And this is deaf people that were expected to hear by lip reading and speak by intimidating the mouth shape of others. So they had to like spell out by themselves, even though they never heard the word. They had to say the without knowing what it actually sounded. They had to recognize the mouth shape. So basically, there was a conference in Milan in 1880, and numerous educators they proposed the idea that the sign language was a lesser intimidation and actually, quite frankly, a disgrace to spoken language. So they later influenced many institutions to teach children the oralism method, which was a huge shift in the deaf culture and actually was very harmful. So that's a quick rundown as to why it was prohibited. Now, a little understanding of the deaf culture and how what it is today is the civil rights era. In the civil rights era, uh, deaf activists joined the civil rights era even after till 1988. So let's take a step back. The civil rights era ended around the mid 1960s, but even then they continue to pursue and push for equality among individuals who have disabilities, in this case, had deaf, were deaf, and they basically encourage institutions to provide closed captioning, to incorporate more translators, to incorporate more inclusivity into their. Pardon me, I'm choking on my words. To particularly have more inclusivity into societal and to recognize uh, that there are opportunities that are limited to them, but there should be a way that should provide equity on it, which is actually what we're going to talk about in the ADA aspect, the American Disability Act, later on in the presentation. But the importance of identity. So, importance of identity. We have deaf versus deaf. Yes, they sound the same, but they are completely different. Deaf, with a hard D and is capitalized, deaf pertains to an individual who is deaf and is associated with the deaf culture. So they speak the language, they associate in different events that they might attend as deaf, and things like that. Now, an individual who is deaf, lowercase deaf, this is typically an individual who's hard of hearing, who's hearing, or deaf completely, and does not participate in the language or the community. So, yes, this is true. Individuals who are deaf, they might not consider themselves to be members of the deaf community because they don't participate in sign language. They might participate in the oralism method, as I mentioned before. So, we also got to consider CODA, which are children of the deaf adults, which were the first interpreters of many deaf families. And this is what we got an understanding between the difference between English and ASL. Now we also have language. So, as I mentioned throughout this video numerous times, American Sign Language. But we also have Pidgin, which is PSC, and that is, quick step back. Pidgin is not an official nor is it a language because it implements sign language, oralism method. It is heavily influenced by oralism method, which I mentioned before was uh, what the deaf community they frowned upon it. So we also have the Rochester method, which is basically just signing, but you're mouthing the words. So if I were to say, uh, let's say, good morning, I would just say. So you could see that I mouthed out the word good morning without making any sound, but I still signed it. That is the Rochester method. And now we have home signs. So typically, you know how we have certain words that we only say in the household, and like think of it like an inside joke. We know what certain words mean because we have such a close social group. And quite frankly, the deaf community also has that. So in their homes, they might have specific signs that just pertain to that, but are not in any relationship to actual words in American Sign Language. So um, let's say this is for drink, even though that this is cup, like drink. So there's a difference. So let's understand ASL, because I've been talking about it so many times. Sign language is not universal. You know the way that we spoken language don't have a universal language? You know how we have different like English, German, Spanish, French, and so on? Yeah, sign language is not universal. I mentioned before that Lawrence Clark, he has what is known as French Sign Language, which is completely different from American Sign Language. And as to why, well, American Sign Language is different from English because of its structure. So it incorporates time, uh, incorporates the aspect of who, what, where, when, which, how, and there are no tense. No tense. From there are also dimensions of American Sign Language, which is hand shape, palm orientation, movement, location, and non-manual signs. Hand shape is the way that we have our hands placed. Palm orientation is like kind of like hand shape, but it's the way that we use our palm. So like this, it's like you, and then this is me. Movement, that's kind of a no-brainer. Location, where we put our hands. So this is mother, and this is father. So mother because like in the old times, women used to wear like these fluffy hats, and the strap went down onto their chin, and then father because of baseball caps. Typically, that's a little quick way to remember some semantic meanings as to sign language. And a non-manual signs is basically eye contact, body language, and so on. So, basic crash course on ASL. So, hello, goodbye, please, thank you, yes, and no. As you recognize, I always use my dominant hand, which in this case is my right hand, and that is typically the hand that I always use for movement. Now, in the structure aspect, when we're having a conversation, if you were to have a conversation that incorporated some aspect of time, time always goes first. From there, who, what, where, when, which, how goes last. So an example would be if you were to structure it like time, so morning, so morning plus subject, morning, I sleep plus verb plus object, you would be able to have a conversation like that. That is the way that ASL is structured. So, essentials in an introduction. You can pause the video if you like to take a quick look as to the different ways to sign the alphabet in sign language, which is also known to be an important aspect to the deaf community because many times when we're incorporating the same word in a conversation, you would have to sign the first word, but then after the words, you would have to sign it in the alphabet aspect. So take a quick look. But we are moving on. Uh, you need to be able to be polite and state your name when you're introducing yourself. And when I say state your name, you got to state your first name and your last name. But there's got to be a pause in between first and last name. I'll teach you in a bit. So you also have to establish your association with the deaf community. Are you deaf or are you hearing? Do you know ASL or do you not? So in an English template, when you're doing an introduction, you typically just say, hello, my name is blank and I am blank. I blank. But in an ASL template, we have, hello, my name blank and I blank. I blank. Yeah, I know the blank sounds a little childish, but let me sign it for you in the ASL template. So, hello, my name, although, here's a gap. I paused my first name. Now I'm going into my second name. Sir Fontes. And I hearing. I learning sign language. And that is how you sign an introduction. Take a shot on it on your next conversation. So, communication. What are ways that are inappropriate and appropriate? So, please, I am emphasizing, never flicker your lights in order to get an attention of a deaf person. This is incredibly rude. So, what should you do? You should lightly tap their shoulder. They typically they are familiar with the aspect that if they're in a setting where an individual is hearing and there's like multiple people, they are recognizing that they might have to like tap their shoulders, and so they expect it. So another inappropriate way of communicating is lip reading. Like I told you before, oralism is frowned upon in the deaf community. So if you expect a deaf person to lip read what you're saying, don't even begin. What you should do is learn how to sign or just even write. Grab a pen, a paper, and write. Or even then, in this technological world that we live in, grab your phone, quickly text, or just write down something in your notes and then show them to them. Also, even though you might be frustrated, do not shout. They can still see your body language and they may interpret it, not may, they will interpret it as an offensive approach. Instead, be patient. Understand that we need to be able to have accommodation in order to have a proper conversation. And again, never have your back against them. How do you expect them to communicate with you and also see what you're saying nor assign when you're not even facing them? Always maintain eye contact with them. So, a lot of people think there are solutions to curing deafness. And let me tell you, deafness is not a disease, nor is it anything to be frowned upon. No, the deaf community is a proud culture. But there are ways to accommodate an individual who is deaf to have an understanding of what hearing is. So this is a cochlear implant, which is a surgical implant that is embedded into the ear and it sends electrical impulses to the auditory nerve. So they are able to pick up on sounds, but this is only typically working at a hard to believe hearing level. So, also, as I mentioned before, a lot of people think that by curing deafness, uh, rather than having to sign, why don't you just lip read? Well, lip reading is ability to see speech sounds, and so by doing so, as I mentioned before, it's frowned upon in the deaf community. So, recognize that even though there are cures, people are saying cures the cochlear implant, the deaf culture is a proud culture. But enough about that. Let's move on to the American Disability Act as that pertains into the workspace. So, the American Disability Act, what is it? It guarantees equal employment for individuals with disabilities through accommodation. And so, the ADA was established because of the deaf activists who pushed, not just because of deaf activists, but many activists pushed for a recognition that there should be equal opportunities for individuals through accommodation. And so, another registered organization within the United States is the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. And what they do is advocate for interpretation and transliteration services. And so, this is typically when a business may want to be hired them or like encourage individuals to come in, teach them translation, things like that. So, just a little thing to keep in mind. So, within the ADA, in perception into the deaf community, there is Title II and Title III. Title II focuses on the state and government aspect, and Title III focuses on businesses and nonprofits. So, the ADA in these two titles focuses on providing qualified sign language interpreters, oral, cued, and real time captioning. But what are some limitations that many businesses may be able to loop around? So, a lot of businesses may declare that they're not able to provide this, having hands-on translator at all times because of financial burden, as it needs to be taken in consideration. And this is one of the limitations within the American Disability Act that is disclosed. And so, one of the things that they may need to consider a business or the government itself, based off the title, is the available resources available, funding and program. High-level officials end up deciding, and if so, if they decide to go with no real on-time interpreters at all times, they have to state a written reasoning to the government in order to disclose this information. And let me keep you in mind that Title II, it is required. The government is required to do so. But because of these limitations, there's another way, there's a loophole around it. And Title III, it's encouraged. So businesses and nonprofits are encouraged uh, to provide these resources when it is available and if it falls into any of these categories. So, wrapping up our webinar. So, the whole aspect was on how we could be inclusive to the deaf community. So, as I mentioned before, the ADA, the Registry of Interpreter Services, the RID, that's what it's called, we can create a more inclusive environment to the deaf community in the workspace by providing an interpreter on site. And yes, I recognize that there is a financial burden on it, but some ways that we can incorporate this is by incorporating ASL basics and the community itself. And yes, some people may be neglected to learn the language or may just be time consuming. But just learning some basics on like your basics on like how I taught you before is a great way to start off. You can also focus on closed captioning. We need to incorporate more closed caption so that it is in more aspect of videos or memos that they might send out. Encourage more written uh, statements to be shared out to communicate with an individual who's deaf uh, in the workspace. We also have to focus on opportunities to be promoted, and that is through involvement of deaf events. Have employees or yourself be encouraged to attend deaf events, learn about the culture, assimilate yourself into the community. Uh, we also have to talk about deaf employees mentorship. So as I mentioned before, there is limited opportunities of growth for individuals who identify as deaf or members of the deaf community. And because of this, they are not recognizing, they do not recognize, nor the businesses do not recognize an opportunity for growth for these members. But if we provide mentorship one on one, on a day, not a daily, but check-ins, create check-ins on a weekly basis or on a monthly basis. Have a mentor to help guide them, help them teach, like build up that experience and that knowledge within the institution. We are able to create a partnership between bridging these gaps. So, and also recognition of hiring more deaf employees, especially in their hiring practices, uh, which I mentioned in the pre-work. What are ways to encourage uh, and work around hiring practices to have a more equal opportunity? So I want to have you reflect as to what you responded to that question, and also reflect as to what you just learned throughout the webinar. So, with that being said, thank you for listening, and I hope you take into consideration of incorporating a more inclusive environment for the deaf community. I recognize that there are many socially marginalized groups within the world, but I took into consideration the deaf community as it pertained to individuals that I myself am learning to work with, but also you should be learning how to work with one another. Thank you, and have a great rest of your night.